Number 1. Luke Trudeell. When deputies arrived at a rural outbuilding north of Marion, Iowa on June 5, 2024, they encountered a scene so violent that it immediately defied explanation. 4 adults were found dead inside the structure. Their injuries were extreme, their bodies unrecognizable in places, and the amount of blood present initially left responders struggling to determine what had occurred. Outside the building, seated on a concrete walkway, was 35-year-old Luke Trudeell. He appeared detached, disoriented, and emotionally flat. He made no attempt to flee, hide, or resist. Within minutes of law enforcement contact, Trudeell began making statements that would turn the investigation from a possible accident into one of the most disturbing mass killings in recent Iowa history. Luke Trudeell had lived a largely unremarkable life in Marion prior to that morning. He worked as a yard laborer for T&K Roofing, a company based in Ely, Iowa. He maintained steady employment and had limited criminal history, a criminal mischief charge from 2008 and an assault causing bodily injury in 2010. To neighbors and coworkers, he did not stand out as violent or unstable. Behind the scenes, however, Trudeell had been abusing methamphetamine heavily. Investigators later confirmed he had been awake for at least 2 consecutive days leading up to the killings, smoking meth continuously. His mental state had deteriorated into paranoia and delusion, setting the stage for catastrophic violence. On the morning of June 5th, Trudeell accompanied his father, Larry Trudeell, to a rural property on Otter Road. They planned to work on a boat stored in an outbuilding on the land. The property belonged to Lon Brown, whose son was staying there with others. At the time, 2 couples were present on the property. Brent Brown, 34, and his girlfriend, Kiana Ryan, 26, both from Cedar Rapids, were staying in the outbuilding. Also present were Amanda Parker, 33, from Vinton, Iowa, and her boyfriend, Ramondis Cooper, 44, also from Cedar Rapids. What began as a routine morning would end with all 4 dead. According to investigators, Trudeell had become convinced that the 4 individuals were involved in a human trafficking conspiracy. There was no evidence to support this belief. It was a drug-induced delusion fueled by methamphetamine and prolonged sleep deprivation. In his own words, Trudeell believed he was acting as a vigilante, carrying out what he later described as justice. Surveillance cameras mounted around the property recorded what happened next. The footage showed Trudeell entering the outbuilding where Cooper and Ryan were staying. Several minutes later, he exited. Shortly afterward, Brent Brown and Amanda Parker were seen entering the same structure, likely responding to sounds or calls from inside. What occurred inside the outbuilding was sustained, deliberate, and exceptionally violent. Prosecutors established that Trudeell used a 42-inch metal pipe as the murder weapon. Each victim was struck repeatedly. The blows caused catastrophic blunt force trauma, including massive skull fractures, deep lacerations, and crushing injuries to the head and upper body. Medical examiners later stated the damage was comparable to injuries seen in high-speed vehicle collisions. None of the victims had a realistic chance of survival. When emergency responders first discovered the bodies, carbon monoxide poisoning was briefly considered due to the enclosed space. That theory was immediately dismissed once responders entered the building and observed the physical condition of the victims and the blood-soaked environment. Trudeell remained at the scene. Surveillance footage showed his father, Larry Trudeell, yelling for someone to call an ambulance, shouting at his son, and demanding to know what had happened. Witnesses described Luke Trudeell as emotionally vacant, mumbling incoherently, and seemingly unable to grasp the reality of the situation. Initially, officers treated Trudeell as a possible witness. That changed rapidly. Before Miranda warnings were issued, Trudeell made unsolicited statements admitting he had struck all 4 victims. He directed officers to the metal pipe used in the killings. His DNA was found on the handle. The victim's blood coated the pipe's surface. Paint fragments from the pipe were later recovered embedded in multiple victims' skulls. Blood spatter consistent with repeated swings was found on Trudeell's clothing and shoes. The physical evidence was overwhelming. There was no indication of another attacker. During subsequent interviews, Trudeell expanded on his delusional reasoning. He claimed the victims were traffickers and said he wanted to take them all down. He expressed concern that his children would hate him for what he had done. He also stated that he felt remorse. One statement stood out as particularly disturbing. When asked why he committed the killings, Trudeell responded that the honest truth was that he wanted to make a movie. Investigators found no recording equipment and no evidence that the assault was filmed. The statement was later suppressed from trial, but remained part of the investigative record. The defense mounted an aggressive strategy. Attorneys attempted to shift blame onto Trudeell's father, arguing that surveillance footage could not definitively identify which man entered the outbuilding. They accused law enforcement of tunnel vision and claimed investigators failed to pursue alternative suspects. The defense also alleged that Larry Trudeell's blood-stained clothing was destroyed without proper forensic testing, and that Luke Trudeell's statements were coerced while he was under the influence of methamphetamines. Larry Trudeell never testified at trial. Investigators were unable to serve him with a subpoena. Prosecutors dismantled the defense theory point by point. Surveillance footage timelines, DNA evidence, blood pattern analysis, forensic pathology, and Trudeell's own admissions formed a cohesive and consistent narrative. There was no credible evidence supporting the involvement of any other person. After a 6-day trial in November 2024, the jury deliberated for more than 2 days. When they returned, they delivered a decisive verdict. Trudeell was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Brent Brown, Amanda Parker, and Kiana Ryan. For the killing of Ramondis Cooper, he was convicted of second-degree murder, indicating the jury believed Cooper was likely the first victim and that the others were killed afterward to eliminate witnesses. On November 18, 2024, family members of the victims quietly wept as the verdicts were read. Some whispered, "Thank you," in the courtroom. Trudeell showed little visible reaction. Sentencing was scheduled for February 27, 2025. He faces life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. First Assistant County Attorney Monica Slaughter called the verdict a significant victory, while acknowledging the emotional toll the long deliberation took on the victims' families. The verdict delivered accountability, but it could not undo what happened inside that rural outbuilding. 4 lives were erased in minutes, driven by methamphetamines, paranoia, and unchecked delusion. And while Trudeell's case shocked Iowa with its brutality, investigators would soon confront another case, one rooted not in drugs or delusion, but in science, patience, and a mystery that haunted Cedar Rapids for nearly 40 years. Number 2. Jerry Burns. 39 years is a long time to wait for answers. Long enough for parents to die without ever learning who murdered their child. For nearly 4 decades, the name Michelle Martino represented one of Iowa's most painful unsolved cases. That changed not because someone confessed, but because a man threw away a plastic straw in a restaurant. Michelle Marie Martino was 18 years old in December 1979. She was a senior at Kennedy High School in Cedar Rapids, described by friends and teachers as driven, talented, and kind. She excelled academically, twirled baton, sang in choir, appeared in school theater productions, and worked part-time at Westdale Mall. She planned to attend Iowa State University to study interior design. Those who knew her consistently stated she had no enemies and no known conflicts. On the evening of December 19, 1979, Michelle attended a Kennedy concert choir banquet. She wore a black jersey dress and a white rabbit fur jacket. After the event, she drove her family's 1972 Buick Electra to Westdale Mall to pick up a winter coat her mother had placed on layaway. Friends saw her inside the mall around 7 p.m. She should have been home shortly. She never arrived. At approximately 4 a.m. on December 20th, mall security discovered Michelle's body slumped in the driver's seat of the Buick, still parked near J.C. Penney. She had been stabbed 29 times. The wounds were concentrated on her face, neck, and chest. Her lungs and aorta were punctured. One wound penetrated her heart, causing massive internal bleeding and death. There was no evidence of sexual assault and no indication of robbery. The crime scene showed signs of a violent struggle. Michelle had defensive wounds, indicating she fought back. Critically, investigators discovered blood at the scene that did not belong to her. It was found on her dress and on the vehicle's gear shift. The killer had been injured during the attack and left his blood behind. In 1979, DNA profiling did not exist. Investigators followed every lead available at the time. They interviewed former boyfriends, co-workers, classmates, and anyone known to have seen Michelle that evening. No suspect fit. No confession came. The case slowly went cold. Michelle's parents, Albert and Janet Martino, lived for years hoping for answers. Albert died in 1995. Janet followed in 1998. Both died without knowing who killed their daughter. In 2006, Cedar Rapids detective Doug Larison reopened the case. While reviewing evidence logs, he discovered something critical. Blood samples recovered from the gear shift had been tested for DNA years earlier, but no follow-up investigation had been done. Larison ordered new testing. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation developed a complete male DNA profile from the preserved samples. The genetic material had survived for decades due to proper evidence storage. The profile was uploaded into COIS, the National DNA Database. No matches were found. The case stalled again. In 2017, Cedar Rapids Police partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based forensic genetics company. Using DNA phenotyping, Parabon created composite images predicting the suspect's facial features based solely on genetic markers. The images generated renewed public interest, but produced no viable suspects. Then came the turning point. Parabon recommended investigative genetic genealogy, a technique still rarely used at the time. In 2018, the unknown DNA profile was uploaded to GED Match, a public genealogy database where users voluntarily submit DNA to find relatives. The database returned a partial match, a person genetically consistent with being a second cousin once removed of the killer. Parabon genealogists constructed extensive family trees, tracing bloodlines backward through generations. Investigators contacted and eliminated relatives methodically. Eventually, the search narrowed to 3 brothers who grew up in Manchester, Iowa: Kenneth Burns, Donald Burns, and Jerry Lynn Burns. None had ever been suspects. None had known ties to Michelle Martino. Police placed all 3 under surveillance. On October 29, 2018, investigators followed 64-year-old Jerry Burns to a Pizza Ranch restaurant in Manchester. They watched him drink multiple sodas using a plastic straw. When Burns discarded the straw and left, officers collected it from the trash and sent it for DNA testing. The result was definitive. Jerry Lynn Burns's DNA matched the blood found on Michelle Martino's dress and gear shift. The probability of a random match was less than 1 in 100 billion. On December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years after Michelle's murder, detectives confronted Burns at his powder coating business. He appeared calm and emotionally flat. When shown composite images created from his own DNA, he stated they looked nothing like him. Investigators informed him they had obtained his DNA from an item he discarded. Burns denied killing Michelle, but could not explain why his blood was present at the crime scene. He repeatedly said only, "Test the DNA." Jerry Lynn Burns was arrested that day. At the time of Michelle's murder, Burns was 25 years old. He was married, had 2 young children, and worked selling farm equipment in Manchester. Over the years, he worked for John Deere and co-owned a truck stop. His name had never surfaced during the original investigation. He had lived an ordinary life while carrying a secret that went undiscovered for nearly 4 decades. Burns hired high-profile defense attorneys, including Kathleen Zellner. The defense challenged the legality of the DNA collection, arguing that genetic genealogy searches violated constitutional protections. Courts rejected these claims, ruling that Burns had no reasonable expectation of privacy in DNA he abandoned in a public restaurant. The trial began in February 2020 in Scott County. Prosecutors presented extensive forensic evidence. DNA experts testified to the statistical certainty of the match. One of the most disturbing testimonies came from Michael Allison, a federal detainee housed near Burns before trial. Allison testified that Burns told him he would take him to the mall if he kept beating him in a card game, a statement prosecutors argued referenced the murder site. Burns did not testify. Jurors later noted his complete lack of visible emotion throughout the trial. After deliberating for just 3 hours on February 24, 2020, the jury found Jerry Burns guilty of first-degree murder. Michelle's sister, Janelle, and her husband embraced as the verdict was read, overwhelmed by relief and grief. On August 7, 2020, Burns was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He briefly suggested someone else may have committed the crime before thanking his family for their support. In March 2023, the Iowa Supreme Court unanimously denied his appeal. The Michelle Martino case became a landmark in forensic history, demonstrating the power of genetic genealogy to resurrect cases long thought unsolvable. Michelle would be in her early 60s today. Instead, her case stands as proof that time does not erase truth, and that even decades later, science can still speak for the dead. And if Jerry Burns' arrest showed how silence can be broken by DNA, the next case reveals something even darker. What happens when someone pretends to speak on behalf of the dead while hiding the truth in plain sight? Number 3. Dustin Honken. Dustin Honken wasn't just a drug dealer. He was one of the most ruthless methamphetamine producers the Midwest had ever seen, and one of the few men in modern American history sentenced to death for murdering children. In the early 1990s, Honken operated a large-scale methamphetamine operation that stretched from Arizona to Iowa. Intelligent, methodical, and trained in chemistry, he produced unusually pure meth and distributed it across northern Iowa. But as his operation grew, so did the risk, and eventually, the people closest to him became his greatest threat. 2 of Honken's associates, Greg Nicholson and Terry DeGeese, began cooperating with federal authorities. Nicholson, a Mason City resident, testified before a federal grand jury in April 1993. Honken soon learned he was facing serious prison time, and he decided witnesses had to be eliminated. On July 25, 1993, Nicholson disappeared. So did his girlfriend, 31-year-old Lori Duncan, and her 2 daughters, Candace, 10, and Amber, 6. They vanished just days before Honken was scheduled to plead guilty to federal drug charges. With no bodies and no witnesses, the case collapsed. Honken withdrew his guilty plea, and prosecutors were forced to drop the charges. 4 months later, another informant disappeared. Terry DeGeese, 32, was last seen in November 1993. Like Nicholson, he was never heard from again. For years, the 5 disappearances remained one of Iowa's darkest mysteries. Behind the scenes, Honken's girlfriend, Angela Johnson, played a critical role. Posing as an innocent bystander, she helped lure victims, acquire weapons, and conceal evidence. According to later testimony, Johnson entered Lori Duncan's home pretending to be a lost cosmetics saleswoman, allowing Honken to force his way inside armed with a gun. What happened next was horrific. The victims were restrained, tortured, and executed one by one. Nicholson was forced to record a statement clearing Honken before being killed. Lori Duncan was murdered next. The two children witnessed the killings and were then murdered themselves so they could not talk. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves outside Mason City. For years, Honken remained silent, but prison changed everything. While incarcerated on unrelated drug charges, Honken began talking, boasting to fellow inmates about the murders. Those conversations reached Angela Johnson, who eventually confided in a jailhouse informant, Robert McNeese, drawing maps of burial sites in hopes of protecting herself. Instead, it sealed her fate. In October 2000, investigators followed those maps. They uncovered the remains of Nicholson, Lori Duncan, and her two daughters in a wooded area. Weeks later, DeGise's body was found in a nearby field. All 5 victims had died from gunshot wounds. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. In 2004, Dustin Honken was convicted of murdering all 5 victims, including the 2 children. The jury unanimously agreed he deserved death. On October 11, 2005, Honken became the first person sentenced to death in Iowa in more than 40 years. Though Iowa had abolished the death penalty in 1965, Honken was prosecuted federally, making execution possible. During sentencing, Honken insisted he was innocent. He accused the judge of having a death agenda and claimed prosecutors manipulated the jury. "I have committed many wrongs," he said, "but never have I taken another life." The court disagreed. Honken received 2 death sentences for the murders of the children and life imprisonment for the 3 adult victims. He was transferred to federal death row in Terre Haute, Indiana. Angela Johnson was also convicted and sentenced to death. To this day, Dustin Honken remains one of the most infamous figures in Iowa's criminal history, a man whose fear of prison led to the execution of an entire family, including 2 children whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Number 4. Christian Rivera. Brooklyn, Iowa, population just 1,700, is the kind of town where people don't lock their doors, where neighbors recognize every car that passes, and where a young woman can go for an evening run without a second thought. On July 18, 2018, that sense of safety was shattered forever. Molly Cecilia Tibbetts, a 20-year-old University of Iowa student, left her boyfriend's house for a routine jog and never came home. Within days, her face was everywhere: yard signs, storefront windows, social media posts, and thousands of t-shirts worn by strangers desperate to bring her home. The reward for information surged toward $400,000. FBI agents flooded into Brooklyn. What began as a hopeful search slowly turned into a haunting mystery. Molly was a psychology major preparing for her sophomore year. She dreamed of earning a doctorate and writing books. She worked at a children's day camp and was deeply close to her family. Her cousin Morgan shared a Snapchat streak with her that had lasted over 600 consecutive days. On that July evening, Molly was staying at her boyfriend Dalton Jack's home while dog-sitting. A former cross-country runner, she headed out around 7:30 p.m. wearing gym shorts, a black sports bra, and running shoes. At 7:48 p.m., surveillance footage captured Molly jogging past a local business, healthy, relaxed, unaware she was being watched. When Molly didn't show up for work the next morning, panic set in immediately. Her phone was dead. Her Fitbit stopped responding. By that evening, her family reported her missing. Morgan noticed something chilling. Their Snapchat streak had broken for the first time in nearly 2 years. The search exploded into one of the largest investigations in Iowa history. Dozens of local, state, and federal agents combed fields, ponds, and wooded areas. Helicopters scanned farmland from above. Investigators pulled Molly's social media data and Fitbit records, tracking her final movements. Molly's mother, Laura Calderwood, pleaded publicly for her daughter's safe return. "We believe Molly is still alive. If someone has abducted her, please release her." Days passed, then weeks. Frustration mounted as hundreds of tips led nowhere. Hope slowly began to fade. Then, on August 16th, nearly a month after Molly vanished, a breakthrough came from an unexpected moment. Deputy Sheriff Steve Keevy spotted a black Chevrolet Malibu parked suspiciously. Investigators had been searching for this exact vehicle after reviewing surveillance footage from the night Molly disappeared. The footage showed not only Molly running, but a black Malibu repeatedly circling the area for over 20 minutes, passing her again and again. Lead investigator Trent Villetta later said, "If you wanted us to find a black Malibu, we could find hundreds. This one was different." The driver was 24-year-old Christian Rivera, an undocumented immigrant from Mexico who had been working at a local farm under the alias John Budd. To co-workers, Rivera was quiet and unremarkable. During interrogation, Rivera initially denied involvement, but eventually his story unraveled. According to investigators, Rivera admitted he noticed Molly running and found her attractive. He followed her in his car, then got out and began running beside her. Molly grabbed her phone and threatened to call police. Rivera said he became angry, then claimed he blacked out. His next memory, he told investigators, was driving with a pair of headphones in his lap, realizing Molly was in his trunk. Rivera led police to a remote cornfield where he had carried Molly's body roughly 20 meters into the stalks, concealing her with corn leaves. On August 21st, investigators recovered her remains. The autopsy revealed Molly had been stabbed between 7 and 12 times, wounds to her chest, neck, and skull. Rivera's arrest triggered a national political firestorm. Then-President Donald Trump referenced Molly's murder at a rally that same day, using it to argue for stricter immigration policies. Molly's family forcefully rejected the politicization. Her father, Rob Tibbetts, wrote publicly, urging people not to use his daughter's death to advance hateful agendas, saying Molly would have stood against racism and division. The trial began in May 2021. Prosecutors presented surveillance footage of Rivera's Malibu stalking Molly, DNA evidence showing her blood in his trunk, and Rivera's own admissions. Then, Rivera took the stand and told a stunning new story. He claimed 2 masked men had broken into his trailer, forced him at gunpoint to drive them around, and were responsible for Molly's death. Prosecutors called the story a complete fabrication. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict on May 28, 2021, guilty of first-degree murder. On August 30, 2021, Judge Joel Yates sentenced Christian Rivera to life in prison without parole, the mandatory sentence under Iowa law. "You and you alone forever changed the lives of those who loved Molly Tibbetts," the judge said. Molly's mother's statement was read aloud. "A young woman went for a quiet run, and you chose to violently and senselessly end her life." Christian Rivera remains incarcerated at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison. His conviction was upheld on appeal in 2023. Molly Tibbetts never got the future she dreamed of, the books she wanted to write, the life she planned to build. And in a town where everyone once felt safe, one ordinary summer evening became a reminder that evil can appear without warning on even the quietest roads. Number 5. Seth Techel. May 26, 2012 began like any quiet Saturday morning in rural Agency, Iowa. But at 5:23 a.m., a frantic 911 call shattered the silence. "My wife's been shot," Seth Techel sobbed into the phone, his voice breaking between hysterical gasps. First responders rushed to the couple's trailer and found 23-year-old Lisa Techel deceased in her bed. She was 17 weeks pregnant with their first child, a daughter they planned to name Zoe Maria. Seth claimed that while he was showering, an unknown intruder broke into the home and shot Lisa, but investigators would soon uncover a web of lies that told a very different story. What followed was extraordinary. 3 separate murder trials over 2 years, 2 hung juries, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Lisa Caldwell had met Seth Techel as teenagers while working at a local bowling alley. Lisa was a state champion bowler, naturally athletic, disciplined, and passionate about the outdoors. After 7 years of dating, the couple married in October 2011 and settled into a trailer on rural land outside Agency in Wapello County. Both appeared to be building promising careers in law enforcement. Lisa worked as a jailer at the Washington County Jail and served as a reserve deputy, following in the footsteps of her father, Todd Caldwell, a respected deputy with the Wapello County Sheriff's Office. Seth was a volunteer firefighter and was set to begin work as a jailer himself. To friends and family, they looked like the perfect young couple. According to Seth, he woke around 5 a.m. that morning and stepped into the shower. Minutes later, he claimed he heard what sounded like a gunshot. When he got out, he noticed the outside door was open and found Lisa unresponsive in their bedroom. Yet Seth didn't call 911 until 18 minutes later. Paramedics found no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and no evidence of an intruder. All 5 guns Seth initially mentioned were accounted for, but something wasn't right. Deputy Marty Wonderland made a decision he would later regret. He called Lisa's father, Todd Caldwell, to the scene. Todd and his wife Amy rushed to the trailer. Amy ran inside. "I held her hand and I rubbed her belly and just said, 'My Lisa, my Lisa,'" she later recalled. Lisa and her unborn daughter were gone. Almost immediately, Seth directed investigators towards a suspect, Brian Tate, their 56-year-old neighbor and a disabled veteran. Seth described Tate as his crazy neighbor, citing ongoing property disputes and Tate's mental health struggles. At first glance, the theory seemed plausible, but as agents with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation dug deeper, cracks in Seth's story began to appear. When questioned about infidelity, Seth admitted he had been texting a coworker named Rachel McFarland, insisting the messages were innocent and that Lisa had already seen them. But during the interview, Seth kept revising his statements. Then, investigators examined his phone. What they found was devastating. Seth and Rachel had been exchanging intimate, explicit messages for months. Messages prosecutors would later describe as reading like a countdown to Lisa Techel's death. Rachel, who worked with Seth at Ottawa Job Corps, believed she was in love with him. Seth repeatedly promised he would leave his wife, but Rachel had begun showing interest in another coworker named Brandon. When Seth learned of this on May 20th, just 6 days before Lisa was killed, his messages became desperate. "Just give me 2 more weeks," he told Rachel. When she asked what he meant, Seth only repeated it. The messages and explicit photos continued right up until the morning Lisa was found dead. Investigators then made a critical discovery. The murder weapon was a shotgun from inside the Techel home, a gun Seth had failed to mention. With the affair, the weapon, the timeline, and Seth's shifting statements, authorities arrested him outside his wife's wake using the very handcuffs Lisa had once worn as a reserve deputy. Seth's first trial began in February 2013. The prosecution relied on circumstantial evidence, the affair, the missing shotgun, the delayed 911 call, and Seth's inconsistent statements. The defense focused entirely on Brian Tate. After days of deliberation, the jury deadlocked. 11 voted to convict, 1 to acquit, a mistrial. The second trial was moved to Henry County in October 2013 due to publicity. Once again, the defense blamed Tate. But by then, Brian Tate was dead, having passed away in September 2012 from probable heart failure. His family believed the suspicion and media attention had broken him. The jury deadlocked again, 9-3 in favor of conviction, another mistrial. Prosecutors refused to quit. "There was no question we would retry it," said Iowa Special Assistant Attorney General Scott Brown. The third trial began in July 2014 in Davenport. This time, the defense revealed that Lisa herself had been having an affair with a married co-worker, an attempt to show mutual marital problems. But prosecutors argued it changed nothing. Seth still had motive, means, and opportunity. Rachel McFarland testified for the third time, detailing Seth's promises and desperation. Jurors saw the full text message timeline. This relationship, prosecutors said, was evidence that read like a countdown to Lisa Techel's death. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. On July 27, 2014, Seth Techel was found guilty of first-degree murder and non-consensual termination of a human pregnancy. Lisa's father, Todd Caldwell, wiped away tears as the verdict was read. "I knew justice would prevail. It was just a matter of how long it would take." At sentencing, Lisa's family confronted Seth directly. Her mother, Tracy Caldwell, delivered a devastating statement. "Seth, I have no doubt that you made sure Lisa could not resist before you took her life. You and I both know she would have fought to survive, so she and Zoe could live." Lisa's sister, Presley, who had once loved Seth like a brother, looked him in the eye. "I am no longer your sister, and I no longer love you." When asked if he had anything to say, Seth replied coldly, "Not at this time." Judge Daniel Wilson sentenced him to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 25 years. The man who once dreamed of a career in law enforcement would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the Caldwell family, justice had finally come, but nothing could restore the daughter, sister, and unborn child stolen that May morning. While Seth Techel's case showed how persistence through 3 trials could finally deliver justice, the next story proves something even more disturbing. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the youngest. When 2 teenage boys turned a baseball bat into a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. Number 6. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. November 3, 2021 began with a missing person report in Fairfield, Iowa, a quiet town of about 9,000 people, roughly 100 miles southeast of Des Moines. 66-year-old Nohema Graber, a beloved Spanish teacher at Fairfield High School, hadn't come home the night before. Her husband, Paul Graber, reported her missing when she failed to return from her usual after-school walk. What searchers would soon discover in Chautauqua Park would shatter this tight-knit community. Hidden beneath a tarp, a wheelbarrow, and railroad ties in a wooded area lay Nohema Graber's body. She had been beaten to death with a baseball bat. The killers were not strangers. They were 2 of her own students, both 16 years old, who had spent at least 2 weeks meticulously planning her murder. Their motive was as chilling as it was senseless: a bad grade in Spanish class. Nohema Graber had dedicated her life to education. Originally from Mexico, she spent decades teaching Spanish to generations of Iowa students, first in Ottumwa, then at Fairfield High School. Those who knew her described a woman deeply passionate about teaching, someone who believed education extended beyond conjugating verbs and memorizing vocabulary. At her memorial service, just days after her death, her son Christian Graber read from her personal notebook. "We, the teachers, must be a positive role model for our students. And even if the students forget my Spanish classes, I hope they remember how and why to smile in life and be honest." Every afternoon after school, Graber followed the same routine. She drove her van to Chautauqua Park and walked the trails, time to decompress, enjoy nature, and clear her mind after a long day in the classroom. On November 2, 2021, that peaceful routine would be her last. That same afternoon, Willard Miller, a junior at Fairfield High School, met with Graber to discuss his failing grade. Miller was angry. In a later police interview, he described frustration with how Graber taught Spanish and how her class was damaging his GPA. For an achievement-oriented student, a failing grade felt catastrophic. But instead of seeking help or accepting responsibility, Miller had already set something far darker in motion. At least 2 weeks earlier, Miller had begun planning Graber's murder. He recruited his friend and classmate Jeremy Goodale to help. Together, they planned everything: where to attack her, what weapon to use, how to move the body, and how to conceal the crime. Miller brought his own baseball bat. They chose Chautauqua Park, knowing Graber walked there every day. After her meeting with Miller, Graber drove to the park as usual, arriving around 4 p.m. Less than an hour later, witnesses saw her distinctive van leaving the park. But Nohema Graber was not driving. 2 young males sat in the front seats. The van was later found abandoned at the end of a rural road outside town. In the woods, Miller and Goodale ambushed their teacher. According to Goodale's later court testimony, Miller struck first. After he had struck Nohema Graber, he then moved her off the trail, where I then struck her, Goodale said as he entered his guilty plea. She died as a result. The attack gave the 66-year-old woman no chance of survival. The teens dragged her body deeper into the woods and concealed it beneath a tarp, a wheelbarrow, and railroad ties they had brought with them. They attempted to remove or hide evidence connecting them to the crime. Afterward, Goodale called a friend for a ride. That witness later told investigators they picked up both boys walking along the same rural road where Graber's van had been abandoned. The teens acted as if nothing had happened. When Graber didn't return home that evening, her husband Paul became worried. She was always punctual, always reliable. By the next morning, he reported her missing. School officials joined the search. Volunteers combed Chautauqua Park. It didn't take long. Graber's van was found. Shortly afterward, searchers made the devastating discovery of her body hidden in the woods. Investigators from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation quickly reconstructed her final hours. She'd been at school, then the park, then her van leaving with 2 unknown males. The break in the case came from an unexpected source: students. Classmates came forward with screenshots of Snapchat messages in which Jeremy Goodale admitted involvement in Graber's death, naming both himself and Miller. Court documents later stated, "The witness identified Goodale as making statements that identify Goodale's admissions that he acted in concert with another person to bring about Graber's death." When police questioned Miller, his story unraveled. He first denied any involvement, then claimed he knew what happened but didn't participate. Finally, he told a desperate and implausible story, claiming a group of masked teenagers forced him to provide his wheelbarrow and drive Graber's van. Investigators immediately saw through it. The evidence was overwhelming. The bat belonged to Miller. Both boys were seen in Graber's van. Goodale's messages were explicit. Witnesses placed them at the scene, and the motive was unmistakable: a failing grade. On November 12, 2021, just 9 days after Graber's body was found, Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Despite being juveniles, prosecutors charged them as adults. Iowa law, however, prohibited mandatory life without parole for juvenile offenders. The case moved slowly. Both teens initially pleaded not guilty. Defense attorneys filed motions to suppress evidence. Legal maneuvering dragged on for more than a year as Goodale emerged as a potential witness against Miller. Then, on April 18, 2023, just days before Miller's trial was set to begin, everything changed. In separate hearings at the Jefferson County Courthouse, both teens pleaded guilty. Goodale's testimony was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. On November 2, 2021, I met Willard Miller at Chautauqua Park, and I understood that he had intent to kill Mrs. Graber. He brought a bat and other supplies to go through with the murder. Miller admitted to planning the crime, but continued to deny delivering any blows, a claim contradicted by both prosecutors and Goodale. Miller was sentenced on July 5, 2023. By then, he was 17. Graber's family delivered emotional statements. Her son Christian spoke of the void left behind. Her brother-in-law noted that Nohema's husband Paul had died earlier that year without seeing justice. Judge Sean Showers sentenced Miller to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years, citing the brutality and premeditation. A high school junior who formulates a plan with his friend and murders his Spanish teacher is a danger to the community, the judge said. Jeremy Goodall was sentenced on November 15, 2023. Now 18, he received life with parole eligibility after 25 years, reflecting prosecutors' belief that Miller was the primary instigator. Both teens appealed their sentences. In September 2024, the Iowa Supreme Court heard Miller's appeal, challenging the length of his parole eligibility. In January 2025, Goodall's appeal was denied. The court acknowledged he had been influenced, but emphasized he was intelligent, capable, and could have stopped the crime. Nohema Graber's murder over a bad grade stands as one of Iowa's most senseless tragedies. A dedicated educator, killed by the very students she tried to teach, guide, and inspire. For Fairfield, a town built on trust and community, the betrayal cut deep. The case is a haunting reminder that sometimes danger doesn't come from strangers. Sometimes it's sitting right there in the classroom. While Miller and Goodale planned their teacher's murder over a failing grade, the next case is even more incomprehensible. When a teenager turned his rage not on a teacher, but on his own family, wiping out everyone he had grown up with in a single night of horror. Number 7. Alexander Jackson. The morning of June 15, 2021, began with a frantic 911 call from a quiet cul-de-sac in northeast Cedar Rapids, Iowa. "There's been a shooting," a young man stammered. "A man broke in and shot me and my dad." When officers arrived at the upscale home on Oakleaf Court, they found something far more horrific. Inside the house were 3 bodies: 61-year-old Jan Jackson, 68-year-old Melissa Jackson, and their 19-year-old daughter, Sabrina Jackson. All 3 had been shot to death in separate rooms. The only survivor was 20-year-old Alexander Jackson, the son who had made the 911 call. He was found with a gunshot wound to his foot. Alexander insisted that a masked intruder had broken into the home and attacked his family. Investigators would soon conclude there was no intruder. The killer was Alexander himself. This was Cedar Rapids' first triple homicide since 1982. From the outside, the Jackson family appeared to have everything. Jan Jackson was a successful professional. Both Alexander and Sabrina were bright students attending the University of Iowa. Alexander had been an Eagle Scout, had no criminal history, played the flute in his high school symphony band, and was known as a polite young man who mowed neighbors' lawns. Sabrina was a high-achieving student who had even introduced then-presidential candidate Andrew Yang during his 2019 Iowa campaign stop. Neighbors described the family as friendly, normal, and close-knit, with no visible signs of trouble. But beneath the surface, Alexander was unraveling. His college grades had collapsed. His GPA was in freefall. His bank account held just $30. And his father had recently issued an ultimatum: get a job or move out. For a young man raised with high expectations and a history of success, the prospect of failure and the shame of being forced out may have felt unbearable. At 8:23 a.m., Alexander called 911. He told dispatchers a masked intruder had broken into the home and opened fire. According to his account, he woke to gunshots and was shot in the foot during a struggle over a rifle. The intruder then fled out the back door. Alexander could only describe the attacker as a black man wearing black clothing and green shoes. The vague description immediately raised red flags. Inside the home, investigators found a devastating scene. Jan Jackson had suffered 5 gunshot wounds to the chest, neck, and the back of his head, each individually fatal. Sabrina Jackson was found shot to death in her bed. Melissa Jackson was discovered on the master bedroom floor, shot multiple times, including once directly into her left eye at such close range that gunpowder soot remained on her skin. From the beginning, investigators were skeptical. There were no signs of forced entry, no furniture out of place, no evidence of a struggle. Neighbors across the street had Ring doorbell cameras. The footage showed no one entering or leaving the Jackson home that morning before police arrived. No neighbors reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. Then came the critical evidence. The murder weapon was identified as a .22 caliber Browning rifle belonging to the Jackson family. Investigators found 2 clear palm prints on the rifle. Both belonged to Alexander Jackson. The rifle's box was found under Alexander's bed. That particular Browning rifle had an unusual loading mechanism, so uncommon that a Cedar Rapids crime scene investigator with years of firearms experience had to search online for a video tutorial just to learn how to load it. Prosecutors argued that a random intruder would not know how to operate such a specialized weapon, but someone who lived in the home would. Medical examiners also determined the shooter had to reload the rifle multiple times to inflict all the wounds, further pointing to someone familiar with the weapon. Bloodstain analysis delivered another devastating blow to Alexander's story. Investigators found blood near Alexander's bed, indicating he had shot himself in the foot there, not downstairs during an alleged struggle, as he claimed. After receiving treatment, Alexander was interrogated for hours by Cedar Rapids investigators Matt Denninger and Sarah Linus. They asked about his academic struggles, his finances, his relationship with his father, and his mental health. Alexander never wavered. He stuck to the intruder story. When pressed on how a stranger could enter without evidence, locate a specialized rifle, know how to load it, commit multiple murders, and steal nothing, Alexander had no answers. "You can't sit there and look me in the eye and tell me that's what happened," investigator Linus told him. Alexander did exactly that. Later that same day, Alexander Jackson was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Bond was set at $3 million. His trial began in January 2023. Prosecutors laid out their case: the palm prints, the lack of forced entry, the ring camera footage, the specialized rifle, the blood evidence, and the motive: academic collapse and financial desperation. Assistant Lynn County Attorney Monica Slaughter told jurors that Alexander shot his father as he came down the stairs, then stood over him and fired 2 more shots into his head. He killed Sabrina while she slept in her bed. He executed his mother at close range. Then he shot himself in the foot to stage the crime. Slaughter highlighted a chilling detail from the 911 call. Alexander never once asked about his mother or sister, because he already knew they were dead. Defense attorney Tyler Johnston argued investigators had rushed to judgment and ignored alternative possibilities. He described the Jacksons as a happy family and insisted Alexander had no reason to commit the murders. But the evidence told a different story. After 6 hours of deliberation, on January 25, 2023, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Alexander Jackson, now 22, showed little reaction as deputies handcuffed him. Family members of the victims addressed the court. Jan's sister said, "Alex wanted the world to think he was a victim of this horrendous crime, but we know that is not the case, and now everyone knows the truth." On March 3, 2023, Judge Lars Anderson sentenced Alexander to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, citing the calculated and horrific nature of the murders. In January 2025, the Iowa Court of Appeals upheld the convictions, finding the evidence of guilt overwhelming. The destruction of the Jackson family remains one of Iowa's most disturbing cases. An Eagle Scout with a promising future chose murder over confronting failure, wiping out everyone who loved him in a desperate attempt to escape his own collapse. And in doing so, he ensured he would never escape at all.